Welcome to the second annual Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture. Historian John Gurda addresses the topic, Public Enterprise, How the Socialists Saved Milwaukee. The lecture was recorded on March 24, 2009 at the Milwaukee Public Library's Centennial Hall. Here is the library director, Paula Kiley.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Paula Kiley, director of the Milwaukee Public Library, and it is a pleasure to welcome you to Centennial Hall this evening. Let's, before we get started, give another round of applause to Patrick Netteshine for the great music he provided this evening. It is indeed a pleasure to be here with you for the second annual Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture. The library is honored not only to be a part of the program this evening and to be the venue for this great lecture, but to be a part of the Zeidler Committee that is responsible for planning the annual lecture. For what greater supporter was there of public libraries than Frank Zeidler? The library continues to be a beacon to many, especially during these difficult economic times. And not surprisingly, use of the library is increasing. We saw a 6% increase in circulation last year, and to date, we've seen a 3.6% increase. In February alone, 8.2% more people visited the Milwaukee Public Library than the prior year. When people are looking for a quiet place to work on their resume, a place to access the internet to conduct a job search, looking for how-to books to save the cost of the plumber, or looking for a good novel or DVD for some at-home entertainment, the library continues to be a great resource and a great equalizer. And of course, we don't do any of this alone. I think about the many partners that contribute to the library and what it is today. And one of the partners that comes to mind for me this evening are our friends at the Harry W. Schwartz bookstores. After 80 years in business, they'll be closing their doors next week. And I bring it up today or this evening because this Friday, we are very honored to be hosting the final Schwartz event in this building. Linda Olson, who is an author of a book called Sonata for Miriam, will be here at 7 o'clock Friday night. And we will be honoring Schwartz bookstores at that time, and we'll also be welcoming Daniel Golden, the new owner of Boswell Books on Downer Avenue, who will be selling books, and I hope you'll be able to join us. Before we begin this evening, I would like to acknowledge the family of Mr. Zeidler. Not everyone was able to be here tonight. Mrs. Zeidler just returned home after a very nice dinner, but some of her daughters are here. Dorothy, Anita, and Clara are here. Son Michael is with us tonight, and a niece, Maxine. And finally, I'd like to introduce Virginia Schwartz, who will introduce tonight's speaker. Anyone who has spent time in the Central Library and has had the great fortune to be served by Virginia will remember the experience. Ginny is one of the most experienced librarians on our staff and currently serves as the coordinator of the Humanities Department. She possesses a wealth of knowledge, the skill to find that knowledge that she doesn't hold in her head, and the energy and enthusiasm that makes all of us feel glad that we asked her our questions. Virginia?
Thank you, Paula. It's such a pleasure to be here this evening. This is only the second Zeidler lecture. The Zeidler Committee was formed shortly after Frank Zeidler passed away because he was so involved in so many organizations in Milwaukee. He touched so many of us that we wanted to get together to find a way to continue to carry on what was important to him. So representatives from many Milwaukee organizations formed the Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture Committee. Last year, we had our first lecture. We had Jeremy Scahill talking about the Blackwater scandal. We were pleased last year, as we are this year, to have Channel 10 taping the program. And tapes of that program are going to be available for sale in the lobby. Oh, was this a commercial? And we are taping the program tonight, so there'll be more to come on that. But also, since I'm doing commercials, and Paula was talking about book sales, our speaker tonight has written probably the definitive work on, it's certainly the definitive work in recent times, and that makes it the definitive work, on Milwaukee history, The Making of Milwaukee, published by Milwaukee County Historical Society. And then made by Milwaukee Public Television into an outstanding award-winning series of programs, which is also available in the lobby. Both the book and the videos are available tonight. Also, one of the great things Frank Zeidler did is to write a book, A Liberal in City Government, and the group that published the book has it available for sale tonight. Now, also available for sale is a book the Milwaukee Public Library published, and this is the poetry of a young Frank Zeidler called Reflections. And because Paula told you I'm Humanities and Archives Coordinator, I'm also functioning as the city archivist, so I wear many hats. So being very efficient tonight, I took my black magic marker and ran into the other room and said, it says that our book is $20, and that's not right. It says right in the cover it's $12. So I carefully corrected the sign. And then the people that did this book said, that's our sign, and it is $20. I said, what can I do? I can't get the sign fixed. It's 5 to 7. And he said, tell the audience the story. They'll love it. So I told it, and you did love it. Thank you. So we needed to have another speaker, and we thought we should have someone talk about socialism tonight. And who should we have but someone who knows Milwaukee history deeply and intimately, having grown up in Milwaukee, gone to school at Boston College, and then at our only University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Way back in the 1970s, he started researching, talking, giving tours, and publishing. And he is now the author. According to One Dust Jacket, he's written 13 books. According to another, he's written 15. But if you look in our catalog, County Cat, which you can all get to from home, www.mpl.org, you will find over 40 listings for things that he has done that we have available for you to look at. And so, who is this very special person? This is none other than John Gurda. Now, there might be some people in Milwaukee who know Milwaukee history who don't know the name John Gurda, but I don't think there are very many. Not only is he a scholar, he is frequently in the library doing research. He's done research like at the County Historical Society, where they produce Making of Milwaukee. But he is a pleasant individual. He understands the rules. He knows what to do. And dear to a librarian's heart. And so when I asked the staff, what could I possibly say about John Gurda that other people didn't know, they said, all you have to say is he's a scholar and a gentleman. And he is. We are very pleased to have him here, but because this is sponsored by the Frank P. Zeidler Memorial Lecture Committee, we thought the president would like a few words. So our president is also a poet. So in talking about who is Frank Zeidler, he has put this into verse. He's promised me it's a short verse. So he's going to introduce John by telling you who Frank Zeidler was. And thank you so much for coming. The sales will be in the hall. We will have an opportunity after the speech for you to ask questions of John. We'll be handing out paper, and you can write your question on the paper, and the ushers will go through the aisles and bring the questions up to us, and there will be time. There's never enough time to ask all your questions of John, but you'll want to know what the next book is that he's working on and things like that. So without further ado, here's the president of our committee, Philip Blank.
Frank Zeidler was a sewer socialist. What means that to us today? As a man of the people, Mr. Zeidler would like this to be free. He would not want me to tell you how to make tax-deductible gifts. International Institute of Wisconsin, note, Zeidler lecture. Please, Mr. Zeidler, forgive me. With his thinking, the Interfaith Conference came into its being. As a labor umpire, his example led to the initiation by his church of the Office for Conflict Resolution. He fought for and won for us what is now our prized gem, MPTV. His commitment to distributive justice led to a strong support of the Wisconsin branch American Civil Liberties Union. As one who early on supported UN, Frank led UNA. He was also a longtime leader of the Mayor's Commission on the UN. Frank saw the merits of socialism early on and taught thereof. He lived the life of a humble socialist and never compromised. With an eye to the future, he spoke frequently at the local group, Milwaukee Chapter of the World Future Society. He fought the sale of interurban rights of way, now forever gone. As one respecting cultural diversity, he went to Folk Fair, and he strongly supported the International Institute. Good government was the hallmark of Milwaukee's early socialists. That still holds true today, but their power wanes. How can the public learn socialism's mention in the preamble? To promote the general welfare is found in our Constitution preamble. Of all the parties, it appears that socialists define common good. They do it better than others. Do you agree? We have socialism. The persons who benefit are corporations. The library was his university. He was top of the class. He grew the city library system with its neighborhood branches. His time in office manifested his respect for transparency. Letters he got were shown to reporters present, and they could respond. He was co-founder of today's Public Enterprise Committee. He had them campaign for his first mayoral bid. When he left office, he tried to influence those who followed. No dice. The press and those who were in office ignored. Would that today's pals had his transparency and integrity. We are here to honor his memory and inspire others to emulate. Students, learn and act to emulate this profound humanitarian. John Gurda and Frank co-taught Milwaukee history. Frank lived much of it. They both gave tours of Milwaukee, the city that meant so much to them. Who's used MPL more than John Gurda? Maybe only Frank Zeidler. John, you're on. You're the second speaker we're having for FPZ.
Thank you, Phil, for that maiku, is right? and thank you, Jenny. I want to say, first of all, I'm honored to be part of anything that has Frank Zeidler's name on it, period. He was a hero of mine for many years, as he was for many of you. And for me, not so much for what he did as mayor, important as those accomplishments were, but for how he lived his life as a citizen of Milwaukee and a citizen of the world. I'm not sure I've ever told in public the story of how I first met him. This was back in 1970 or 71. I was a kid fresh out of college, wet behind the ears, and being part of the solution and not the problem was working at a Southside youth center called Journey House, which is still very much there. And that was my first real job out of college. And one of my tasks was to find work for some of the teens in our program. And that brought me one night to a meeting of the South 16th Street Advancement Association. They were the neighborhood business people. They were the small business owners on our street. And they met in the hall of Bert and Eddie's Bar, which was a classic Southside watering hole. After the minutes were read, after the committee reports were filed, the president announced that Frank Zeidler would be stopping by that evening for reasons unspecified. It kind of piqued my interest. Frank showed up not long after. His driver that night was Charlie Mccarthy, who was a Marquette U law prof who was, like many of us, took turns driving Frank around. They had been on a tour of neighborhood meetings. Some people bar hop, some people meeting hop. And that was one of Frank's pastimes. After he was introduced, Frank gave an impromptu 10-minute speech on the South Side's growing Mexican population. He talked about where they came from. He talked about why they were coming to Milwaukee. He emphasized that they were good workers with strong family connections. You've got to remember that in these days, back in 70, 71, South 16th Street was predominantly Anglo, almost entirely Anglo. What Frank was trying to do was to help the old guard adjust to a transformation that was just over the horizon. And when I thought about that, the idea that a former mayor would go out of his way on his own time to help a neighborhood group assimilate change, that was a jaw-dropping concept. But it was so typically Frank. It was so absolutely typical of Frank. He believed in the power of knowledge to overcome fear. He believed in the power of history to provide context. And he believed deeply in his own hometown, all its neighborhoods, all its ethnic groups. At the same time, he had a keen interest in world affairs, from nuclear disarmament to American intervention overseas. If there was ever a better exemplar of think globally and act locally, I have not met him or her. Frank felt a passionate concern for both the United Nations and for South 16th Street, which, as he was foreshadowing 40 years ago, is now Cesar Chavez Drive. So Frank Zeidler was a role model, a model citizen, a hero to many of us, but he was also the keeper and the extender of a tradition that had a profound impact on Milwaukee, and that, of course, was municipal socialism. I'm sometimes asked what there is in Milwaukee's history that sets us apart, that makes us different from any place on earth. And I often say three things, all related: Germanism, socialism, and beer. And I want to concentrate on the second earmark tonight, and that is socialism. No major city in the U.S. gave control of its government to the Socialist Party, much less kept them in office for most of 50 years. That record makes us unique in all the country. You often hear socialism used as kind of a dirty word these days. And one conservative conference earlier this month, one of the panels was titled, "Bailing Out Big Business. Are we all socialists now?" A rather profound misunderstanding of that philosophy. But the inference was the road to socialism is the road to hell. They overlook, of course, the growth of government over the last 8 years, the runaway spending, the unchecked executive power of the previous administration. That kind of stereotyping and that kind of red baiting has been going on for a very long time. But the view from Milwaukee makes it clear that there is nothing to fear and much to admire in Milwaukee socialism as it was practiced here. What they did in Milwaukee was they saved the city. And I don't think that's too strong a word. Milwaukee, like most of its peers, was in dire need of civilization 100 years ago. If you look at the history of all of urban America, what you see is a recurrent pattern, a cycle of corruption reform, with corruption having the upper hand for very long periods of time. Milwaukee's first boss was a man named Jackson Hadley, who was a Yankee, came up from the East Coast. He emerged in the 1850s when Milwaukee was not even 10 years old. This begins very early in our career. He built a democratic machine on a foundation of public works contracts that he controlled and provided jobs for the German and the Irish immigrants in particular. One newspaper blasted him as king of the tax eaters. Once he had passed from the scene, His role was taken by a man named Boss John Hinsey. He ran the Democratic machine in the 1870s and 80s. This guy was transparently corrupt, especially on the issue of electricity, which was the emerging technology of his period. He was president of Milwaukee's Common Council, and as president pushed through in 1885 the city's first electric lighting contract, awarded to a firm called Badger Illuminating of Chicago. In a related development, John Hinsey became part owner of Badger Illuminating. He also headed a cable streetcar company that just happened to get the city's first streetcar franchise back in 1887. It was ultimately absorbed by We Energies, as we know it today. Back then it was the Milwaukee Street Railway. And that company was just a potent force in local politics. Its president was a man named Henry Clay Payne, who was the string puller for the state party. And his resident manager was a man named John I. Beggs, who carried a little black bag to City Hall anytime he wanted a franchise extension or a new right-of-way. But the champion of graft in Milwaukee's history, the prince of political darkness, was David Rose. He was Milwaukee's mayor from 1898 to 1910, with one 2-year term off when he was beaten by the boy mayor, Sherburne Becker. He was a small-town lawyer who became a silver-tongued orator and a full-time scalawag. He was elected back in 1898 on a platform of reform, trying to go after the streetcar company, which he cozied up to as soon as he entered office. He made very close friendships with Milwaukee's madams, saloon keepers, proprietors of gambling dens. There were brothels operating in the shadow of City Hall, literally, the area between the river and City Hall today. So he ran a wide-open town and greeted conventioneers by the thousands during his term, and they were not all coming to enjoy the museum and the symphony. How did he explain his stance on prostitution? Men are and always have been men, the mayor declared. They have their natural passions, which in the great majority of cases must and will be gratified. If desires can be fed without turning the animal loose to destroy and ruin young girls, but confine him to the paths which have been provided for him to follow, where lust can be subdued, where diseases can be prevented, is it not better than to try to prevent what cannot be and never has been prevented? This is our mayor talking. It's our highest civic official. He was nicknamed all the time Rosie for obvious reasons, and loved to see his people, as he said, at play and happy. The Common Council was just as crooked. You could have bought a vote in the Common Council floor for $5 or a suit of clothes. The tenor of the times was revealed in one franchise debate when a Common Council member said, "Alderman Richards is of so little importance that he is not worth a cent to anybody to buy him." Back in the 1800s, that was the worst thing one politician could say about another. Not everyone was so understanding. No, this was over the limit, even in a time of easy virtue. Grand juries of the early 1900s returned 276 indictments against public officials, both city and county. Rose himself escaped persecution, never did time, never even was prosecuted. But the DA on the case, Francis McGovern, who later became the progressive governor of Wisconsin, called Rose the self-elected, self-appointed attorney general of crime in this community. So it's clear where the buck stopped back in the early 1900s. The sad thing is that this was standard behavior in urban America. This was done all over the country. Back in 1904, muckraker Lincoln Steffens published a book called The Shame of the Cities, in which he profiled the corruption of cities like St. Louis, Minneapolis, Memphis, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, and Chicago, but not Milwaukee. We didn't even make the cut. That's how bad things were in the rest of the United States. So conditions here and elsewhere were wretched, but enough was finally enough. Reform movements emerged all across the country, some led by progressives, some led by populists or laborites or even church ladies. In Milwaukee, the standard bearers of reform were socialists. They rose from the political chaos of the 1800s to become an influence on local government that is still very much with us in the present. Where had their movement come from? It came first of all from Germany. It came over in the minds and hearts of the fabled 48ers, a group of failed anti-royalist rebels who had to flee the country for America after the 1848 revolution had failed. They were well educated, they were highly cultured. They founded the Turner Societies, the Freethinker congregations, the debating clubs that provided a forum where ideas of the left were aired. These were the intellectual seedbeds of what became Milwaukee socialism. It came, secondly, from a world-class concentration of industrial workers. Most Milwaukeeans of the late 1800s worked with their hands in one kind of manufacturing or another. They were highly attuned to any and all appeals to class consciousness, especially after the 8-hour shootings of 1886. See a lot of familiar faces here, maybe joining us again May 3rd this year. We will commemorate the 8-hour tragedy in Bayview. What happened was on May 5th, back in 1886, a crowd of roughly 1,500 workers marched on the Bayview rolling mill, among the largest employers in the Milwaukee area, to show their support for an 8-hour day without a cut in pay. They found the state militia waiting for them inside the plant gates. The militia opened fire, killing at least 5, and as many as 9 from published reports. Outrage over that senseless bloodshed galvanized the working class and fueled working class activism for years. Milwaukee socialism came finally from the fertile mind of Victor Berger. The left has always been famously fractious, prone to splintering over ideological fine points. What the situation called for was a uniter, not a divider, but a uniter. And Victor Berger answered the call. He was an immigrant from Austria. He worked here variously after arriving as a young man, as a tutor, a drama critic, a German teacher, and a newspaper editor. But he became in time a full-time socialist. He was both a tactician and a strategist and a theorist. His tenets were clear. He believed, first of all, in gradualism. He believed the cooperative commonwealth would come one day, but would come only after a long period of education and real-world reform. His approach, as his comrades' approach as well, owed more to Ferdinand Lassalle than to Karl Marx. It was more geared to evolution than revolution. Frank Zeidler called Victor Berger an evolutionary moderate. It's a good description. More than anything, Victor Berger was a practical socialist. He saw beyond the ideological trees to the electoral forest. His goal was to educate by governing, and you could only govern by being elected. So the key to success for Milwaukee socialists was what they called the personal union of organized labor and the Socialist Party. After a few years of organizing, Milwaukee's leading unionists and Milwaukee's leading socialists were the same people. That was called the Milwaukee Idea. They were also, as a group, very effective campaigners. The Socialists had a famous bundle brigade that could reach every household on any issue with literature in any language they desired within 48 hours. Almost internet speed, back adjusting for scale in those times. Berger's Social Democrats, which was the name of the party formerly, began to field candidates back in 1898. They were buried, predictably, but a small caucus on the Common Council earned respect for their unimpeachable integrity. And Berger was fond of declaring that for a normal politician, honesty was the highest virtue to which they could attain. With us, he said, this is the first and smallest requirement. That's where you begin. So year by year, the tide rose. In 1902, socialists had 14% of the mayoral vote, rose to 25% in 1904. So people like David Rose began to hear footsteps behind them. And Rose warned that the socialists would substitute the red flag of anarchy for the glorious old emblem of our country. But the voters were unmoved. They were learning in time to trust the socialists. And in 1910, they gave the party the keys to the city. In a landslide, Emil Seidel became mayor, a pattern maker by trade. Victor Berger was elected to Congress from the North Side. Daniel Hone became our city attorney. Charles Whitnell became our city treasurer. And socialists took 2/3 of the seats on the Common Council. A majority of them worked with their hands. So it was the triumph of the working man, the triumph of the working woman. What did they do in office? They distinguished themselves as champions of public enterprise. They did not just manage, they did not just enforce laws and regulations. They advocated a program of public necessities that had a major impact on Milwaukee's quality of life. Among those were public parks, Charlie Whitnell's passion, public libraries, public schools, public health, public infrastructure, including sewers rather, the sewer socialists, public port facilities, public manual training, public natatoria, and public housing. Underlying that notion, supporting it, a public enterprise, was a deep and abiding faith in government, especially local government. The Socialists worked to build a community of interest, a sense of the common good by invoking very specific principles. They believed that government was not a sandbox for special interests. They believed it was not a fountain of rewards for faithful service. They believed it was not a source of grease for the gears of the free market. They believe that government is, above all of us together. It is the place where conflicts are mediated, in which balance is sought, in which we struggle to find our common humanity. These are rather Obama-like notions. Emil Seidel summarized that vision, I think, quite powerfully in his memoirs. He said, "Some Eastern smarties called ours a sewer socialism. Yes, we wanted sewers for the workers' homes, but we wanted much, oh so very much more than sewers. We wanted our workers to have pure air. We wanted them to have sunshine. We wanted planned homes. We wanted living wages. We wanted recreation for young and old. We wanted vocational education. We wanted a chance for every human being to be strong and live a life of happiness. And we wanted everything that was necessary to give them that. Playgrounds, parks, lakes, beaches, clean creeks and rivers, swimming and wading pools, social centers, reading rooms, clean fun, music, dance, song, and joy for all." That was our Milwaukee Social Democratic movement. There was but one way to get all of that: go after it and get it. This was clearly a movement founded on the common good and working for the common man and woman. So Emil Seidel was the early hero of the movement, but he was unfortunately swept out of office in 1912 after a 2-year term. The fusion of Democrats and Republicans who showed their ideological bankruptcy by joining forces against the Socialists. That left Dan Hone as city attorney to carry the torch. He had a 4-year term, so he kind of sat out that stampede. He ran for mayor in 1916, and he won, staying in office until 1940, a period of 24 years. He was an outstanding champion of public enterprise, a masterful administrator, a skilled politician, and certainly a man of deep ethics. It was during Hone's tenure that Milwaukee won award after award as the cleanest, safest, healthiest big city in the entire U.S. We won the public health trophy so often that they had to retire us from competition to give other people a chance for a time. Hone himself became a picture on the cover of Time magazine back in 1936, when Time called Milwaukee perhaps the best governed big city in America. Hone's tenure was ended in 1940 by Karl Zeidler, who was a charismatic baritone with no particular ideology. He was lost at sea in 1942, and Milwaukee continued under the caretaker government of a Southsider named John Bone. By that time, there had been a sea change in local party politics. You had the elections becoming nonpartisan officially back in 1912, but the Socialists remained and maintained a highly disciplined party organization. With the rise of the New Deal after 1932, it was Democrats who co-opted the Socialist power base, which was labor unions, Socialist programs, and even Socialist rhetoric. Dan Hone himself became a Democrat after leaving office in 1940, and Milwaukee became a safely Democratic stronghold. But socialism continued under Frank P. Zeidler, Karl's younger brother, who was elected mayor in 1948 and stayed until 1960. He had not a single socialist serving with him, but he was proud to bear the standard. His opponents were not above red baiting, and one of my favorite stories of the 48 campaign is one of his opponents said that if he were elected, Frank Zeidler would socialize the corner grocery store. What did Frank do? He went out and got the endorsement of the Independent Grocers Association. And as mayor, Frank continued that tradition of public enterprise and fiscal responsibility. He rebuilt an infrastructure that was untouched almost virtually for 15 years during the Depression and World War II. You think potholes are bad now, think of them as in 15 years from 30 until 45. He began the freeway system, which everyone thought back in those days was a civic necessity. He championed public TV. Frank had to veto 4 Common Council resolutions before Channel 10 got on the air in 1957. So he played a crucial role in public TV of today. He also supported public libraries. The annex behind us was built in 1957 on Frank's watch. He also was part of a major initiative on his watch. Milwaukee waged a very aggressive annexation campaign. Its land area doubled between 1948 and 1960. The result being there is still farmland inside Milwaukee's corporate limits. No other northern city has that distinction. He did all this without breaking the bank. There is a common misconception, a common myth, that the socialists were these tax and spend radicals who wanted nothing more than to empty the public treasury. Nothing could be farther from the truth, in Milwaukee's case especially. Socialist officials here were every bit as frugal as the most penny-pinching German Hausfrau. Dan Hohn put the city on a pay-as-you-go basis, and in 1943, Milwaukee became the only big city in America that was free from debt. Frank Zeidler believed in the same pay-as-you-go philosophy. He resisted issuing bonds for improvements because he didn't want us to be in bondage to the banks. His wishes were often overruled by the electorate. But that was the sound fiscal responsibility plank of the socialist platform throughout. Next year will mark a century since the socialist landslide of 1910 and 50 years since Frank Zeidler left City Hall. The accomplishments of that extraordinary 50-year period certainly seem inevitable in hindsight. They've been part of our landscape for so very long, but they were anything but inevitable. Opposition was constant, votes were close, and many battles were lost. Nor did voters always have the same lofty ideals as those they voted for. The Garden Homes housing project, still there up in the north side around Atkinson, north of Capitol Drive, was one of Dan Hohn's pet causes. It was launched as a cooperative in 1923. Within 2 years, residents voted to end the co-op and put the houses in private ownership. They weren't paying a lot of attention to what might be called the ideological fine print. They wanted a city that worked, and they trusted socialists to make that a reality. But there was a broad sense of harmony, a sense of cooperation between governors and governed here, a vital sense that we were all in it together. The result was an expectation of honesty and efficiency in local government that's still very much with us. That expectation has suffered its share of bumps and bruises in recent years, but it remains normative. I believe the height of public outrage over the recent lapses reflects the depth of our conditions about what constitutes good government, and that is the gift of the socialists. Did they make a difference? Yes, they did. Can we make their legacy our own? Yes, we can. Can we revive the spirit of mutualism that they so fervently believed in? Yes, we can. Can we work once more, not for our own narrow interests, but for the commonwealth of all? Yes, we can, and our future depends on it. Thank you. Thank you. And we have time for questions. Do we have questions? Anybody have one want to shout out while we're waiting for paper?
A comment more. I think it's true. It's perfectly true that Milwaukee was the largest of the socialist governed cities, but I think it's also possible
Sure.
To that broader national movement, which elected mayors not only here in Sheboygan, Racine, Beaver Dam, Wausau, and across the country. What happened to that movement during World War I especially
Right.
had a lot to do with what eventually happened to the Socialists in Milwaukee.
You're right, yes. Milwaukee was not an island, at least for a time it was not an island. There was a broad-based movement, and there were, I think, by one count, more than 70 socialist mayors. What makes Milwaukee unique is the size of the city and the duration of socialist government. No one comes close in that regard. And there was that movement during the World War II era and before in the Depression, when the New Deal kind of did that co-optation of the base. But you're right. In 1917, when the U.S. jumped into World War I, the National Party voted against intervention. And that was pretty much the death knell. The movement in those years is kind of a broad-based political force. And Milwaukee, Dan Ho and Victor Berger, they were uncertain about Dan Ho's mayor. He had to enforce the laws, so put them in a rather difficult position. And that tended to shrink the movement much more Milwaukee based. That's absolutely correct. Other questions?
Why do so many people have such a negative attitude today about socialism? Is it because of the connection to communism? But many young people, socialism.
Right. I think if you go to Europe and people, to ask about socialism there, they'd have a whole different take on what it means and its benefits than people in America do. I think a lot of it is that classic red baiting, especially from 1917 on, the association between socialism and Soviet communism. And people would be just shameless, about talking about David Rose talking about the red flag of anarchy. Whole different movement being waved over the city hall. So it was just this, for political advantage, tarring, all the left, with the same brush, which was not only intellectually, but socially irresponsible as well. And it goes on today. Certainly it's still part of the fabric here. We have some written ones too. How did World War I affect Milwaukee socialism? It had a profound impact. How might Mayor Zeidler have responded to the county executive's recent interest in privatizing the airport? in a word, no, not at all. Were there any similar privatization schemes while Zeidler was mayor, and how did he respond? It was more the opposite, I think. Between 48 and 60, it was Milwaukee had finally had a chance to take over the streetcar system, the transportation system. That had been a cause in Milwaukee socialism from the very beginning. And I talked about how important a political machine what became We Energies funded and sort of got on the rails. There were referenda. There was one in 26, I think, and the Socialists had worked out a compromise where they guaranteed them some profit, but at the same time, the city could buy into the system, eventually take it over. Voters rejected it. So that was by about a 2-to-1 margin. And then by the time the 50s rolled along and Frank was in office, then it might have been more possible to take over the system because it was dying. Because the We Energies, what became We Energies, no longer wanted it. So it was spun off to another private company. And the last streetcars, 1958, and then 75, the county takes over the bus system as we know it today, and has not distinguished itself in maintaining that once proud system. Can you talk about what Dan Hone did to help people in the Great Depression? One of the things that Hone did, this is a bit earlier in World War I, he would buy wholesale stocks of groceries and sell them at cost to people throughout the city. And that was during a time of just rampant inflation after World War I. During the Depression itself, in the 1930s, there was a division of responsibilities. Relief was the county's responsibility. It was not the city's. And that is why the city could balance its budget by 1943. We have to sort of append that footnote. In the city's case, there were early on work relief programs. And the city would do one very creative financing technique. They issued baby bonds, which functioned as scrip, kind of a homemade currency in which they paid their employees trying to keep the city solvent. And the faith behind that script was so good, so reliable that it passed as money in neighborhood stores around Milwaukee. So like so many the socialist initiatives, very creative and not always ideological, but very creative and targeted to the problem at hand. How come Milwaukee was the last large city to have public ownership of public transit despite electing 3 socialist mayors? It was a cause. And the answer very simply is that the electorate didn't want it. And some of that was the utility lobbying. It certainly was something that they were trying very hard to avoid. At the same time, the impact all that agitation had, and Dan Hohn, he was called Fighting Dan, and a lot of his reputation was earned as a utility basher. That was his favorite target. And the pressure that he and others put on the utility raised the level of service and kept fares low. So even though there may not have been formal public ownership, the fact that you had this constant drumbeat from the highest officialdom in Milwaukee, pushing the system to better service, lower fares, that had an impact on the system as it developed. Comment on Henry Meyer's use of socialism's gift and his changing of it for unsocialistic reasons. You could write a book on Henry Meyer. He took office, and he took office in 1960. And my own feeling about Meyer, he was, I think, a good technocrat in a sense. He knew what the administrative machinery of government was, but shameless in terms of his failure to use political capital, to move the city's agenda forward. Most of his initiatives depended on someone else doing something, federal, state, government, anyone but here in Milwaukee. And that allowed periods of 28 years when a lot of the problems that may have been addressed earlier, the blight and poverty of Milwaukee Central City especially, may have been addressed before they became as critical as they have become in the more recent past. What was the impact, if any, of the socialist legacy on black-white race relations in Milwaukee? And part of the cooperative commonwealth, and they were very much a part of the culture as well, but it was officially colorblind, and Dan Hohn himself, among other things, was a very fierce supporter of a group called the Columbia Savings and Loan Institution, founded back in, I think, 26 by Wilbur and Artie Halyard. They came from Beloit and wanted to support home ownership in Milwaukee's black community. So they began Columbia Savings Loan, and Hohn was so involved that I think he helped them draft some of their founding documents. So there was this continual source and sense of support, togetherness. Even though at that time the black population was much smaller, the Socialist Party was a big tent and tried to include all. Frank himself, obviously, was a champion of equal rights and equal responsibilities for everyone. And when they opened the doors to the Hillside Housing Project in 1948, soon after Frank became mayor, keys were given to a black family and to a white family. And Frank's line was, let us be sure that all people can mean it when they sing, "My country 'tis of thee." So that was, he lived and breathed it. Is there a connection between Milwaukee's socialist past with the current attempt to legitimate sick time benefits for workers? There is certainly a philosophical connection, and the city itself was, before the 8-hour movement became more general in private industry, the city put its workers on the 8-hour day without a cut in pay. So there is a long tradition of worker-oriented benefits on the city's part itself, and I think it's fairly easy to see how that might, there's a strong felt connection between that and the current movement that 9 to 5 is leading. Was there any interaction between Joe McCarthy and Frank Zeidler? Did McCarthy offer any opinions on the Milwaukee Socialists? These probably not entirely positive. What I recall Frank saying is he was surprised that people took Joe McCarthy so seriously. He thought he was a lightweight, a demagogue, and people would see through him. It was easier for Frank to see through people than it was for many of the rest of us to see through complete shams. In the case of public TV, Joe McCarthy was carrying water for the commercial stations who wanted very much to keep a license for educational TV, it was called at the time, out of the public's hands. And there was not a direct confrontation, but they were very much on opposite sides of that question. So they weren't at loggerheads, there weren't sort of head-to-head debates, but they were very clearly on opposite sides of virtually every question. But Frank Zeidler did not look at Joe McCarthy as the threat, that he's sort of been blown up to be in more recent years. How did Milwaukee Socialists relate to the Progressive Party? It's a good question. I said earlier when people were trying to save the cities, trying to rescue urban America from this morass of just horrible ethical lapses, it was the progressives in some cities and states that sort of carried that standard of reform. And Wisconsin was unusual in having progressives outstate and socialists in Milwaukee. You'd think, they were very much almost hand in glove. They had different bases. Here in Milwaukee, the original base was working class and very heavily German, although it became multi-ethnic. The progressives were very much rural and Yankee and Scandinavian. So you had kind of this cultural divide. So that made it somewhat difficult for them to translate each other's ideas into common practice. At the same time, Victor Berger thought that some of Robert La Follette's reforms, the direct initiative, the recall, regulations, he thought those were kind of more ameliorative than changes that really would change things. They were kind of tinkering with the mechanics of government when he was after something a bit grander. But when the situation changed as a result of the National Party's stance in World War I, as a result of the New Deal, and the power base began to shrink, Victor Berger actually was part of a coalition, sort of a farmer-labor progressive coalition, that ran Bob La Follette for president. So there was kind of this, a new coalition that sort of overcame some of the older, if not animosities, distances. So I think when he died, Victor Berger called La Follette the Great American. So there was kind of a mending of fences that had been somewhat torn asunder in previous years. But they were, the 1912 legislature, 11-12, a lot of that was the socialists would vote for the progressive causes and vice versa. So there was a lot of political alliance on actual legislation. Will we ever look at taxes as a means for common good, as they do in Norway and Sweden? High taxes, but health care and education for all. We have become this incredibly tax-phobic society. And I, for one, am willing to put a sign on my lawn saying, "Will pay for services." You do get what you pay for. And a story my father-in-law told, a Norwegian Lutheran preacher from the Midwest, said there was a farmer who was trying to wean his pig from food. And he gave him a little less every day, a little less every day. He almost had him weaned, and the pig died. Think of that in terms of government. Think of starving the body politic, which is just what's going on with currently our transit system, our park system. If you don't feed it, forget about growing it, it'll die. So I think that's where we are now. And if there's one, just horrendous casualty of the pension scandal back in 2000, 2001, it's, I think, not a loss, but a diminishment of belief, faith, and trust in our government. And as I said, that is proportional to the height of the expectations. Providence, Chicago, that wouldn't have been a big deal. In Milwaukee, it was a huge deal. And what it has done, I'm afraid, it has made Milwaukeeans, with the help of a lot of demagoguery, pushing it in that direction, think that anything that goes into the public coffers is wasted, as money kind of flushed down the drain. When in fact, again, government is all of us. Government is all of us together. Government is all of us together working for the commonwealth. And that's something I think we need in this room, to kind of bring to the public consciousness again. One more? Okay. Do you think the socialist institution and extension of civil service positions kept them in power longer than they might have been, or did it allow them to lose power? There was a great story about Victor Berger. When the socialists won in 1910, people would sort of deluge his office with requests for jobs. He said, "For the love of Karl Marx, who do they think I am?" So there was, certainly there were patronage jobs, but the socialists distinguished themselves in a practice of hiring the best person for the job. No, these were people who were very good technically, sort of textbook government. So I think that the civil service was certainly used, and certainly there were people who, other things being equal, may have been rewarded for party service, but never to the extent that it was true for the older line parties. So I don't think it had an effect on either shortening or lengthening their time in office. One more? Okay. If the early socialists were sewer socialists, would our modern day progressives be properly called ice cream socialists? We are in the dairy state, David. No, I think beer socialists, would probably be a little broader rubric. Well, I thank you all for coming. I know we are adjourning. We have to be out of here at 8 o'clock. We are adjourning to the hall next door. See you over there.
Thank you so much, John. There's so many more questions, and there's so little time in life to answer them all, but that's what your public library is for. We have lots of answers, so come and see us. Thank you to everyone that made this evening possible.
We have an award for John Gurda, and it's not the usual type of plaque. It's something unique that was conjured up by a subcommittee that has very creative ideas. John, take this with pride.
Thank you, Phil.